eroded by the scratchings and carvings of 1,000 previous pupils. We were merely 18 days into our initial training as junior interrogators. Inquisitor Hapshant had stormed in, slammed the door, cast his stack of grimoires down on the main lectern, which made us both jump, and declared, "A servant of the Inquisition who makes chaos his tool against chaos is a greater enemy of mankind than chaos itself. Chaos knows the bounds of its own evil and accepts it. A servant of the Inquisition who uses chaos is fooling himself, denies the truth, and damns us all by his delusion." On the lakeshore at Miqual, I was not fooling myself. I knew how desperate this gamble was. Commodus Voke, dead 50 years by then, had once said to me, and I paraphrase, for I did not record it word for word at the time,
"Know your enemy is the greatest lie we own. Never submit to it. The radical path has its attractions, and I admit I have been tempted over the years of my life. But it is littered with lies. Once you look to the warp for answers, for knowledge to use against the arch-enemy, you are using chaos. That makes you a practitioner. And you know what happens to practitioners, don't you, Eisenhorn? The Inquisition comes for them."
On that desolate beach, I felt sure I could sort truth from lies. Vogue had simply misunderstood the fineness of the line. Midas Betancourt had once, during a late night of drinking and Glavian rules regicide, said,
"Why do they do it? The radicals, I mean. Don't they understand that even getting close to the warp is suicide?"
With the rune staff in my hands on that frozen island on Jura, I knew it wasn't suicide. It was the opposite. Godwin Fishig, in a Gravefield shrine on Cadia, had once warned me to stay away from any hint of radical sympathy.
"Trust me, Eisenhorn. If I ever thought you were, I'd shoot you myself."
It wasn't that simple. Emperor damn me, it just wasn't that simple. I thought of Quixos, such a brilliant man, such a stalwart servant of the Imperium, so totally polluted by treasonous evil because he had tried to understand the very filth he fought against. I had declared him heretic and executed him with my own hand. I understood the dangers. Cruor Volt thundered towards me. I uttered the last of the potent syllables and dipped my mind into the warp. Not the simmering warpscape of the Titan's mind link, but the true warp. Channeled by the rune staff and warded by the prayers I had ritually intoned, I flowed into a vaster, darker void. I reached across the fabric of space towards Gudrun, far away, an entire subsector away, towards a private estate on the Insume headland. I reached into it, into a secret oubliette that had been vacuum-sealed, warp-damped, void-shielded and locked with 13 locks. Only I knew the codes to break down those barriers, for I had set them myself. It was crumpled in the middle of the floor, wrapped in chains. I woke it up. I set it free. I jerked out of my trance. The rune staff bucked in my hands as the unleashed demon energy flared through it. I fought to retain my grip and to enunciate precisely the words of command and the specific instructions. Like a small sun dawning, the enslaved demon poured out of the head of the rune staff. Its radiance lit up the dismal shore and cast a long shadow out behind the Titan.
"Cherubael," I whispered. "Yes."
"Kill it!" Lightning crackled. A freak storm suddenly erupted over the lake, swirling the heavens and driving rain down in sheets, accompanied by fierce winds and catastrophic electrical displays. A ghastly white thing, moving so rapidly it could only be registered as an after-image on the retina, surged out of my staff and went straight into the black bulk of Cruor Volt. The Titan hesitated, mid-step, 1 foot raised. It shuddered. Its great arms flailed for a moment. Then its chrome skull face cracked, crazed and shattered, blowing out at a burst of sickly green light. Cruor Volt swayed, the rainstorm drenching off its creaking bulk. A halo of light lit up the lakeshore and the old PDF base. Rune Voiding, ancient enemy of mankind, exploded from the waist up in a globe of furious white heat. Nothing of its head, torso, or arms survived the immolation. The legs, one foot still raised, tottered and swayed, and then collapsed, falling sideways like an avalanche, and destroying the ruined remains of the station's dish. Rune Voiding was dead. Fade Thuring was dead, and I was unconscious, hurled back by the death blast. And that meant Cherubael was free. If it had fled then, it would have escaped. Indeed, it might have fled deep enough into the miasmic warp to evade me forever, even if I exhausted what was left of my life trying to summon it back. It was wary of me now, and knew my tricks. Certainly, it might have escaped far enough to avoid my clutches for many years to come, and in that time have cost the Imperium dearly. But it did not. The demon was too consumed by rancor for that. It came back to kill me. I woke with a start, and realized instantly that Cherubael was free thanks to my loss of control. I looked around, but it seemed like I was alone on the beach. The sky was still swollen with storm clouds, and lightning formed crackling golden crowns around the peaks of the mountains. The rain was easing, pattering across the glossy, wet pebbles and the steaming ruin of Rune Voiding. My skin prickled. I knew it was still here. I had done the unthinkable, and now I had to undo it. Cherubael had to be bound again. It could not be allowed to remain free. I picked up the rune staff. The rain was washing the filmy blood off its hard, polished form. I held it firmly in my left hand and drew Barbarisata. The blade twitched, tasting the demon in the air. Gracious Emperor of mankind, hallowed be your majesty. Bright be your light everlasting. Vouchsafe your servant in this hour of peril.
That won't save you,
said a voice. I switched around, but there was no sign of a speaker. Bright be your light everlasting. Vouchsafe your servant in this hour of peril, so that I may continue to serve you, great lord, and purify your dominion of—
It won't, Gregor. The benediction of Terra. It's just words, Gregor. Just words.
Continue to serve you, great lord, and purify your dominion of man, casting out all demons and changelings of warpcraft.
But I have more than words for you, Gregor. I liked you, Gregor. Of all men, you had a spirit I admired. I worked for you. I spared you more than once. Consider that. All I asked in return was that you honor our compact and release me. And what did you do? You tricked me. You trapped me. You used me.
The words seemed to echo all around me, but no matter how fast I turned, I could not see it. Its voice was in my head. I struggled to continue the repetitions, struggled to keep hold of the sense of the benediction, but it was hard. I wanted to answer its taunts. I wanted to rage at it that it had tricked me first. There had been no compact between us. It had used me to fashion its own escape from the enslaving charms Quicksos had wrought around it. I dared not. I focused on the repeats. Barbarisata shivered from hilt to tip, resonating with the psychic power that washed around me. Vouchsafe your servant in this hour of peril, so that I may continue to serve you, great lord. A star came out. Over the lake. A hazy ring of white around a brilliant, gleaming centre. Almost fluttering, like a leaf on the wind, it eddied down towards me and settled a few meters away. The pebbles beneath it turned to glass. The light was almost too bright to look at. Cherubael hovered in the centre of the glare. He was at his most deadly now. Non-corporeal, a demon spirit, raw and bare, unfettered by a fleshy host. I could not resolve any real details in the light. In truth, I had no wish to gaze upon the demon's true form. It was not even man-shaped any more. I had always presumed white light to be pure and somehow chaste, to be noble and good. But this whiteness was unutterably evil, chilling, its purity an abomination. Hallowed be your majesty, bright be your light everlasting.
Shut up, Gregor. Shut up so I can hear myself kill you.
My weapons, staff and sword, were useless physically. Cherubael had no host body to destroy. But they were strong psychically. I had banished Cherubale with the rune staff once before, and, as far as I know, obliterated his demon kin profanity. But my mind had been stronger in those battles, and psychic weapons are only as powerful as the will that directs them. Cherubale knew how tired and ill-focused I was. I could feel it trying to weaken me by teasing out the agonies I felt inside. Bequin, Medea, Amos, Rassi, Ha, it wanted me to think about the deaths of those dear friends so that I would be weakened still further by grief. But it was weak too. It had just expended huge reserves of power vanquishing a Titan. The light surged forward to test me, I think. I swung Barbaricata to deflect it and felt the electrical impact down my arm. It surged again, and I swept the staff around, driving it back. It circled me. I'd stung it. It knew it was in for a fight. If that's what it wanted. I lunged at it, Barbaricata keening. Cherubale blocked with a bar of luminous energy and convulsed out a pulse of pale radiance that blew me off my feet into the air. I landed hard on the shingle, but sprang up fast, remembering every close combat move I'd been taught over the years by the likes of Harlan Nail, Kara Swall, Arianod Essu Swedir, Midas, Medea. It was coming right onto me, blinding bright. It was like fighting a star. I smashed at it with the head of my staff and then somersaulted out of its path, landing on my feet and sprinting away. I ran under the smouldering arches of Cruer Volt's fallen legs, and then back up the tough slog of the beach towards the station. I could distinctly hear the air rush as it burned after me. I feinted left, but it had guessed as much. The demon star was right on me. I swung my sword, leapt to the right, and vaulted over its next blade of light, using the staff as a pole. Cherubale laughed. Its cackling voice followed me as I sprinted up between two longhouses. The demon star chased after me, its psychic force scattering the beach stones behind it in a wake. I heard a groaning, crashing sound and realized the walls were closing in. Cherubale was lifting both longhouses off their blocks and crushing them together with me in between. I tore through the wall of the left-hand prefab with Barbaricata and leapt through as the juddering huts slammed into each other. Cherubale burned through the fibre-ply wall to get at me, and was greeted by my counter-attack of stabbing blade and staff. I could drive it back, but I couldn't do any more than that. My mental reserves were just not strong enough. My only chance was to bind him again. But how? Dronicus came out of nowhere. I believe, or at least it is a notion I cling on to for the sake of my sanity, that the Emperor of mankind provides help for his true servants in their hour of need, even in the strangest forms. Dronicus, old, insane Dronicus, had clearly been observing the day's dreadful events from hiding, and now he emerged because he had made a gravely mistaken apprehension. He had seen the white light of the demon destroy the Titan. To him, therefore, the white light was a friend because it had vanquished a foe. To him, the potent white light was the Emperor returned to save him. He ran out of the shadows, calling the Emperor's name, praising him, piteously expressing his gratitude. He was an ancient, emaciated man dressed in dirt and rags. He should have offered no threat to the demon whatsoever, except that, in the Emperor's honor, he had retrieved the fallen Aquila altarpiece from the chapel and was holding it up in front of him. Cherubale howled and backed away, tumbling like thistledown along the dirt track between the longhouses. Perplexed, Dronicus ran after it, offering words of worship to the Emperor that must have driven holy spikes into Cherubale's rotten soul. I had a moment's respite from the assault. I looked around. I knew I had to think fast. Bastian Vervoek was still alive. He was a bloody, broken mess, his clothes and hair virtually burned off him from the cutter's death blast. Though I loathed him for what he had done, I felt pity as I saw him. His eyes were still yearning. They seemed to light up with joy as they saw me approach. He reached out a bloody hand. He thought I was coming to rescue him. I confess here now that I hate myself for what I did. That I despised Vervoek does not excuse it. He was an odious wretch who had cost me more dearly than I could say, but he was still a servant of the Inquisition, and, damn him, he worshipped and trusted me. But there was no alternative. I made the right decision. I had released Cherubale because Cruer Volt simply had to be stopped for the good of mankind. Now Cherubale had to be stopped, and I was forced to make a similarly hard choice. I will pay, in time. In the hereafter, when I come before the golden throne. I knelt beside him. His yearning face looked up at me. Damn that yearning puppy look.
Master.
Bastian, are you a true servant of the Emperor?
I am.
And you will so serve him in any way you can?
I will, master.
And are you pure? Foolish question. Vervug's damned purity had led to all his mistakes. His puritanical piety had made him a liability in the first place. But he was pure. As pure as any man could be. I placed my hand on his chest and made my fingers wet with his blood. Then I daubed certain runes and markings on his forehead and face, on his neck and his heart, muttering seldom-heard imprecations from the Malus Codicium.
What are you doing?
He wavered. Damned questions, even now. What must be done? You are doing the Emperor's work, Bastian. A scream howled out of the station, and Andronicus appeared, running terrified towards the lake. His hands were on fire, dripping with white-hot molten metal. Cherubbaal had finally found the strength to melt the Aquila. Still screaming, the poor old man plunged into the icy lake, the water steaming and spitting around his agonized hands. Cherubbaal's deadly star came shimmering down the beach towards me. "Forgive me, Vervug," I said.
Of course, master, he mumbled. For what?
He added, suddenly. Bellowing the incantations of binding, the litany of servitus, the wards of entrapment, I met Cherubbaal head-on, the rune staff glittering with power. "In servitutem abduco, I bind thee fast forever into this host." "What in the name of hell happened here?" Fischig bellowed, his gun raised as he ran down towards me. "Everything. Nothing. It's over, Fischig." "But what is that?" he asked. The demon host floated a few centimeters off the ground next to me. I had fashioned a leash from my belt, tied off around Vervug's scorched, distended throat. "I have trapped a demon, Godwin. He is bound and cannot harm us now." "But Vervug?" "Dead. We must honor him. He has given his all to the Emperor." Fischig looked at me warily. "How did you know the means to bind a demon, Eisenhorn?" he asked. "I have learned much. It is an Inquisitor's job to know these things." Fischig took a step back. "Vervug," he began. "He was dead before you used his body, wasn't he?" I didn't answer. 3 shuttles were powering in across the lake, preparing for landing. The reinforcements summoned by Elizabeth had finally arrived. Chapter 7. Taking leave of Miquol. Gudrun, Sanctuary. Her heart's desire. I wanted nothing more than to be gone from the place. It had exhausted me and cost me. My followers, well-drilled specialists all, deployed from the shuttles and took control of the area, rounding up the last of Thuring's dismayed accomplices. I was told that Menderev and Koth were on their way too, bringing with them units of militia and inquisitorial guard. I wasn't going to wait around for them. There were things I wanted as few people as possible to see. I issued instructions that would bite great holes out of my personal coffers, but I didn't care. I sent Bequin away on a shuttle as fast as possible, with Nail and Burgundy guarding her. Nail was told to get her condition stabilized at the nearest general infirmary, and then arrange passage for her off-world, to the distaff's headquarters on Messina. They took Kara Swole with them too. Kara was alive, but seriously wounded. I gave Fischig strict instructions to remain behind as my proxy. His heart didn't seem in it. I knew the demon host was troubling him more than he dared to say. His brief was simple. Secure the island until the main inquisitorial party arrived. See to it that a full statement was made and that the cache of dormant Chaos Titans was destroyed. Then formally close the examination until further notice. It didn't seem unreasonable. A senior Inquisitor had just risked all and lost much, stopping a battle Titan. His withdrawal from the juror examination for recovery seemed utterly justified. I would contact him later, and take it from there. I was about to leave on another of the shuttles with the silent, shrouded demon host, when the first piece of good news that day came to my attention. Medea and Amos had survived. They were cut and battered, but she had dragged Amos from the cutter crash and got him to cover before Vervuk had ejected. They had lain in cover, dazed and breathless. They had seen everything. I embraced them both. "You're both coming with me," I said. "Gregor, what did you do?" Medea asked. "Just get on the shuttle." "What did she mean?" Fischig asked. I didn't answer him directly. I was too tired, too afraid that my stumbling explanation would not satisfy him. "See that things here are done properly. I will contact you in a month with instructions." I gave him my rosette badge of office so that his authority would be unquestioned. It was a gesture of the frankest trust, but it seemed to disturb him. Then I held out my hand, and he grasped it with a half-hearted grip. "I'll do my job," he said. "Have I ever let you down?" He hadn't, and I suppose that was his point. Fischig had never let me down, but perhaps now the reverse was not so true. 2 days later we were ensconced in a suite of cabins aboard the far trader Pulchritude, en route to Gudrun in the Helican sub. A 3-week passage, Emperor willing. I slept for long periods during the voyage, the deep and thankfully dreamless sleep of the soul-weary, but my fatigue lingered. The work on Miquol had been draining, mentally and emotionally. Each time I woke, feeling rested, there was a moment of precious calm before I remembered what I had done. Then the anxieties returned. Every day of the voyage I made 2 visits. The first was to the ship's chapel, where I said my observances more dutifully and strictly than I had done in 100 years. I felt unclean, violated, though the violation was self-inflicted, I know. I longed for a confessor. In better days I would have turned to Elizabeth, but that was not possible now. Instead, I prayed for her survival. I prayed for Swoll's health to be restored. I made offerings and lit candles for the souls of Paul Rassi, Duclain Har, and poor Dahult, who had perished in the cutter crash. I prayed for Bastian Vervuk's soul and craved absolution. I prayed for Fischig's understanding. In my service to the God Emperor, I have always considered myself a dutiful and faithful soul. But it is strange how the everyday customs of worship become so easily neglected. During that voyage, having stumbled closer to the path of heresy than at any time in my life, I felt, ironically, as if my faith was renewed. Perhaps it takes a glimpse over the lip of the abyss to truly appreciate the pure heavens above. I felt chastened and virtuous, as if I had survived an ordeal and emerged a better man. During the moments of self-doubt and anxiety, and they were numerous, I wondered if that sense of spiritual improvement was simply subconscious denial. Had the events of Miquol really been an overdue wake-up call to steer me smartly back onto the Puritan path, or was I deluding myself like Quixos and all the others who had fallen into the abyss without even realizing it? The second daily visit was to the armored hold where the demon host was secured. The Pulchritude's captain, a stern Ingoranian called Gelb Statis, had almost refused point-blank to accept the demon host aboard his ship. Of course, he didn't know it was a demon host. Very few individuals in the Imperium would know how to recognize one, and besides, I had draped the silent figure in hooded robes. But there was a tangible air of evil and decay around the shrouded monster. I'd been in no mood to bargain with Statis. I'd simply established my credentials with my signet ring, given him my personal guarantee that the guest would be properly monitored, and paid him 3 times the going rate for our passage. That had made the whole venture more appealing for him. I'd chained the demon host in the hold, and spent 10 hours inscribing the area with the correct sigils of containment. Cherubbaal was still zombie-like and dumb, as if entranced. The severe trauma of its binding was still lingering, and for the while it was docile. On each visit, I triple-checked the sigils and, where necessary, refreshed them. I used a quill and ink dye to permanently mark in the runes I had painted on its flesh and blood. That was chilling work. Vervuk's body had healed and was now glossy and healthy. His eyes were closed, but his face was still that of the young Inquisitor, though the boy's forehead was beginning to bulge with the vestigial nub horns that were sprouting from the bone. On the 9th day it opened Vervuk's eyes. The blank wrath of Cherubbaal shone out. It had finally come through the terrible rigours of binding, rigours made worse by the crude and rudimentary way I had performed the rite.
"He wants you dead,"
were the first words it spoke. "Am I speaking to Bastion or Cherubbaal?"
"Both,"
it said. I nodded. "Nice try, Cherubbaal. I know Vervuk is gone from that body."
"He hates you, though. I tasted his soul as he passed out of this body, and I passed in. He knows what you did, and he's taken that dread knowledge to the afterlife with him."
"The Emperor protects."
"The Emperor craps himself at the sound of my name,"
it responded. I slapped its face hard. "You are bound, Lord Demon Prince, and you will be respectful." Floating off the dirty hold floor, wrenching at its securing chains, Cherubbaal began to scream obscenities at me. I left. On each return visit, it tried a different tack. On the 10th day, it was pleading, remorseful. On the 11th, sullen and promising grievous harm to me. On the 13th, silent and uncooperative. On the 16th, sly.
"The truth of it, Gregor,"
it said,
"is that I've missed you. Our times together have always been exhilarating. Quixos was a cruel master, but you understand me. On that island you called on me for help. Oh, we've had our differences, and you're a tricky so-and-so. But I like that. I think my existence could be an awful lot worse than being in your thrall. So, tell me, what do you have planned? What glorious work will you and I do together? You'll find me willing, ready. In time, you'll be able to trust me, like a friend. I've always wanted one of those. You and me, Gregor, friends, working together. How would that be?"
"That would be impossible,"
"Oh, Gregor,"
it chided. "Silence," I said. I couldn't stomach its silky bonhomie. "I am an Imperial Inquisitor serving the light of the golden throne of Terra, and you are a thing of filth and darkness serving only yourself. You are everything I stand against." It licked its lips. Vervuk's canines were becoming ice-white fangs.
"So, why did you ever decide to bind me, Eisenhorn?"
I regularly ask myself the same question, I said.
"Release me, then,"
it whispered.
"Cut me free from these pentagrammic bindings and let me go. We'll call it even. I'll go, and we'll never bother each other again. I promise. Let me go, and that will be the matter done."
"Just how stupid do you think I am?" I asked. He floated up a little higher, cocked his head on one side, and smiled.
"It was worth a try."
I was at the door when he called my name again.
"I'm content, you know, being bound to you."
"Really?" I replied with disinterest. It nodded gleefully.
"It gives me ample opportunity to corrupt you entirely."
On the 19th day, it nearly got me. When I entered the hold, it was sobbing on the floor. I tried to ignore it, checking the sigils, but it looked up. "Master," it said. "Vervuk?" "Yes, please, Master. It's gone away for a moment, and I have control again. Please, cut me free. Banish it." "Bastion, I forgive you, Master. I know you only did what you had to do, and I'm more grateful than you could know that you chose me as worthy for this desperate work. But please, please, while I have control, banish it and release me from this torture." I approached it, gripping my rune staff. "I can't, Bastion." "You can, Master.
Now, while there's a moment clear. Oh, the agony! To be locked in here with that monster, to share the same flesh. It is gnawing away at my soul and showing me things to drive me insane. Give mercy, master.
I reached out and pointed to a complex rune inscribed on his chest. You see this?
Yes.
That is the Rune of Voiding. It is an essential part of the binding transaction. It empties the host of any previous soul so that the demon can be contained. In effect, it kills the original host. You are not Bastian Vervu because Bastian is dead and departed from this flesh. I killed him. You mimic his voice well, as I would expect, because you have his larynx and palate. But you are Cherubael. It sighed, nodded, and floated up again to the limit its chains would permit.
You can't blame me for trying.
I slapped its face again hard. No, but I can punish you. It didn't react. Understand this, demon. Binding you, using you, that has cost me dearly. I hate myself for doing it, but there was no choice. Now I have enslaved you again, I am going to take no chances. The correct containment of you will now become my life's primary devotion. The history texts will not remember me as a man so driven to accomplish things he got lazy and slack. There is no escape from me now. I will not allow it. You are mine, and you will stay mine.
I see.
Do you understand?
I understand you are a man of the highest piety and resolve.
Good.
Just one thing. How does it feel to be a murderer?
Earlier, I remarked that very few citizens of the Imperium of Man would recognize a demon host or understand what one was. That is true. It is also true that the select group who would know included several of my followers. Those that had been with me on 56 Izar, Ichin, Cadia, Farnus Beta. Amos and Medea certainly understood the concept of demon hosting. I had briefed them myself. I felt that Medea, like Fishig, only vaguely understood what I had brought onto the pulchritude with me, though they regarded it with shuddering suspicion. Amos knew, though. He knew damn well. As far as I could tell, he knew everything that it was possible to know without going mad. But he had been with me longer than any of them. We had been friends and companions for more years than I dared count. I knew I had his trust, and that I'd have to err wildly before he questioned my methods. I realized after a day or two of the voyage that he wasn't even going to mention it. I couldn't have that. I wanted openness, so I brought the matter up myself. It was late one night, perhaps the 5th night of the voyage. We were playing double regicide. 2 boards in parallel. One played backwards, using militants as crowning pieces. The other played long, with sentries wild, and a freedom to regent up on white square takes after the 3rd sequence of play. This was the only formation of the ancient strategy game that even began to test his mind, and sipping the best Amasek Statis could provide. Our passenger, I began, picking up a squire piece and then putting it down again as I contemplated my next move. What are your thoughts? You've been very quiet. I didn't believe it was my place to remark, he said. I moved the squire to militant 3 and immediately regretted it. Uber, how long have we been friends? I could tell he was actually about to calculate. I believe we first met in the 7th month of... I mean, roughly. Well, to say friends, perhaps several years after our first meeting, which would make it... Could we agree that a rough estimate would be a very long time? He thought about it. We could, he said, sounding unconvinced. And we are friends, aren't we? Oh, of course. Well, I hope so, he said, promptly taking my Dexter basilisk and securing a ruthless toehold into my second line. Aren't we? Yes. Yes, we are. I look to you for answers. You do? Sometimes I think those answers could come without me having to ask the questions first. He said. He was about to move his Yale. He raised the bone-carved piece and studied it closely. I have always wondered about the Yale, he said. A heraldic beast, obviously, tracing its origins back into the ages before the Great Strife. But what does it represent? The analogies of the other pieces, given historical traditions and the structure of imperial culture, are obvious. But the Yale, of all pieces in regicide, that one puzzles me. You're doing it again. Doing what? Procrastinating. Avoiding the issue. Am I? You are. I'm sorry. He put the piece down again, taking one of my raptors in a move I simply hadn't seen coming. Now he had my militant in a vice. Well? Well? What do you think? He frowned. The Yale. Most perturbatory. I rallied and took his Yale abruptly. It was a foolish move, but it got his attention. About the other matter. The passenger. It's a demon host. Yes, it is, I said, almost relieved. You bound it into Vervug's body on Mikwal. I did. I think you watched me do it. I was concussed. Drowsy. But yes, I saw it. What do you think about that? He made a guard piece a regent and crossed into my sinister field. The game would be over in another half-dozen moves. I try not to, for what it's worth. I try not to imagine how a man I have followed and believed in for so long suddenly has the means and power to unleash a demon, channel it, and bind it again. I try not to think about the possibility that Bastian Vervug was alive when the binding occurred. I try to believe that my beloved Inquisitor hasn't crossed a line from where there is no crossing back. Checkmate, he added. I conceded both boards and sat back. I'm sorry, I said. For what? For putting you through this. Your questions are... No, I don't mean that. In the course of my hunt for Quixos, I learned several dark things. Chief of those was the means to control a demon. It is knowledge that I would have chosen never to use, but the Titan was too much. It couldn't be allowed to survive. I had nothing left in my arsenal except dark lore. I understand, Gregor. Truly. This conversation wasn't even necessary. You did what you had to do. We survived. Most of us, anyway. Chaos was denied. That's the job, isn't it? No one ever said it would be easy. Sacrifices have to be made, or the God Emperor's work will never be done. He leaned forward, his augmetic eyes glittering in the firelight. Honestly, Gregor, if I thought you had become some demented radical, would I be sitting here playing regicide with you? Thank you, Uber, I said. Amos had given me a harder time than I had expected. Medea, on the other hand, I was braced for, and her reaction surprised me too. Demon what? I don't care. You don't? Not really. Thuring is all I care about, and you used everything you had to get him. I did. Well, good for you. We were sitting in amongst the plush cushions of the Pulchritude's observation deck. She peered at me, frowning. Oh, I get it. You're afraid that all of us will think that you've become some heretical psycho-crazy. By all of us, she meant my staff. Do you? Hell no. Get over it, boss. If I could do what you can do, I'd have done the same. Screw Thuring any way you can. I sighed. I didn't do it for your father, Medea. What? I mean, I did, but I didn't. I wanted to avenge Midas, of course, but I only unleashed the demon because Thuring and his damned Titan threatened more than just us. That planet, you mean? That planet. And others. Right. What's the matter? She stroked her hair back off her face and reached for her drink. You're telling me that if the planet hadn't been in danger, you wouldn't have done the whole demon thing? No. I want you to understand this. I wanted Thuring dead. I wanted him to pay for your father's death, but I didn't release Cherubael in vengeance. That would have been petty and small-minded. I could never have justified that, not even to myself. I released the demon because Fade Thuring had become more than just a personal enemy. He'd become an enemy of the Imperium. I had to stop him then, and I was out of options. What I mean is, it was a totally pragmatic decision in the end, not a weak emotional one. Whatever. Thuring suffered, didn't he? He burned. That's all I care about. But you owe me, though. I do. You swore it. On your secrets. That I'd be there when you were. No thanks to you. And not so I could play a part and make Thuring suffer. So you owe me. And I want that secret. Now. What secret? You choose. But it's got to be the darkest one you have. Since you brought it up. What about this Cherubale? And that was how I came to tell her everything about the demon host. Everything. I did it because of the honor of our oath. I also did it, I believe now, because I wished to unburden myself to a confessor, and Beckwin wasn't there. I did it, and didn't even pause to think what might result from it. God, Emperor, forgive me. I have always loved Gudrun, the old capital world of the Helican subsector. For a long time I had made my main home on Thracian Primaris, a world crusted by cities, riddled with crime, lamed by overpopulation. But I had only lived there for the sake of convenience. It was the capital world, after all, and the palace of the Inquisition was sited there. I visit it as little as possible, for it depresses me. But after the vile events of the Holy Novena 5 decades before, I had transferred my chief residence to the more relaxing climes of Gudrun. Returning there, I felt somehow safe. We bade Startis farewell and offloaded our luggage onto a privately chartered shuttle. I had prepared a cargo pod for Cherubale, fully inscribed and warded, the accomplishment of which took many hours. I said the appropriate rites and chained it inside, adding a charm that would render it docile. The pod was loaded by mute servitors into the shuttle's hold. We dropped planetwards. From the ports of the passenger bay, I looked down at the green expanses of the world. The great stretches of wild land and forest, the blue seas, the tight order of the ancient cities. For many years it had been the subsector capital, until the bloated giant Thracian Primaris had commandeered that role. I knew from experience that evil and corruption lurked here as much as it did on any imperial world. But this was the epitome of imperial life, for all its vices and flaws, a singular example of the very culture I had devoted my life to safeguard. We made a detour on the descent. I felt it prudent to secure Cherubale somewhere other than my residence, though I had previously stored it in the secret oubliette below the foundations. If there were any official consequences to the incident on Jura, my estate could be subject to all manner of unwelcome scrutiny. I covertly owned a number of premises on Gudrun. They were not held in my name, so that they could be used as safe houses or private retreats. One was a semi-ruined watchtower in the wilds, 300 kilometers south of my home, a lonely, remote spot that I had found conducive to meditation over the years. Using the shuttle's servitors, I placed the warded cargo pod containing the demon host in the tower's crypt, made the necessary rituals of holding, and activated the simple but efficient alarm perimeter I had installed in the tower when I first purchased it. It would do for the while. Later, I would be very thankful I had made that decision. My home was a dignified estate out on the Insume headland, 20 minutes flight time from the venerable lagoon city of Dorsey. Called Spaton, after the feudal family that had built it, it was an H-plan villa constructed of grey ooslite stone with a green copper tile roof. There were adjoining garages and stables, an aviary, a drone hive, a famous landscaped garden and maze laid out mathematically by utility Kraus, a water dock down in the private inlet, and a perfect silex lawn. It was surrounded to the north and east by untenanted woods, fruit orchards, and ample paddocks, and from the terrace it had clear views over the Bay of Bishin. Yarat, my housekeeper, welcomed us back. It was late evening, and the residence was warm, clean, and ready for occupation. Plump, and dressed in her trademark grey gown robe and white-veiled black cap, Yarat was very old by then. Alongside her were Jubal Kirscher, my head of security, and Aldemar Sullus, my rubricator and librarian. Beside them, Alina Coy of the Distaff, and the astropath Yekud Vance. The rest of the house staff, 30 of them, maids, ostlers, gardeners, cooks, sommeliers, étoiles, and launderers, were lined up in fresh-pressed white uniforms behind them, along with the 5 black-armored officers of the security detail. I greeted each one personally. Yarat and Kirscher had employed several newcomers since I had last been there, and I made a point of talking to them and learning their names. Litu, a perky junior chambermaid; Kronsky, a new member of the security detail; Altwald, a new head groundsman, inheriting his job from his father, who had retired. I wondered when Yarat would retire, or Kirscher, come to that. In the case of Yarat, probably never, I decided. My first act was to open the stronghold oubliette in the basement. I shut down the shields and deactivated the locks, and then spent a long time obliterating all traces of what the oubliette had been used for. I used a flamer to scour the walls and burn away the runic inscriptions. The grisly remains of Cherubael's previous host form, now an empty husk, lay amid the slack chains, and I cremated that too. The host form had been a vat-grown organic vessel I had privately commissioned for use in the original summoning. At the time, it had been a hard enough decision just to use a synthetic body. I thought of Vervuk and shivered. I burned everything. Then I bathed and stayed a long time in the hot water. 2 weeks I spent recuperating at Spaton. I had tried to rest, or at least recover, during the voyage home, but there is a tension in travel itself, and my concerns about the demon host's rudimentary confinement had prevented me from relaxing. Now I could rest at last. I took long walks around the headland's paths, or stood on the point watching the waves crash into the rocks at the fringe of the inlet. I sat reading in the gardens during the warm evenings. I helped junior staff members collect early windfalls into wicker drowsies in the orchard. I went nowhere near the library, the maze, or my office. Elizabeth was never far from my thoughts. Amos served as secretary during that period, a job that Beckwin would previously have undertaken. Around breakfast time every morning, he would inform me of the number of communiques received overnight, and I would tell him to handle them. He responded to general letters, filed private ones for my later attention, and stalled anything official. He knew there were only a few kinds of communique that I would permit myself to be troubled with if they arrived. Word of Beckwin, a direct communication from the Ordos, or anything from Fischig. On a bright morning early in my 3rd week there, with dawn mist fuming off the lawns where the early sun caught it, I was sparring with Jubal Kirscher in the Pugnasium. It was the 3rd morning we had done so. Realizing how out of condition I felt, I had commenced a regime of light combat work to tone myself up. We were dressed in body gloves with quilted shield sleeves, and circled each other on the mat with scorai, basket-hilted practice weapons from Carthai. Jubal was a weapons master, but he was getting a little old, and on peak form I had no trouble besting him. Where he truly excelled me was in combat law and the techniques of military science, which he had studied all his life. He used those that morning, preying on my softness and slowness, overwhelming my superior strength and speed with patient expertise. 3/4 of an hour, 5 rounds, 5 touches to him. His old lined face was glowing with perspiration, but he was 5 times the winner I was. "Enough for today, sir?" he asked. "You're going easy on me, Jubal. Beating you 5 love straight is going easy." I hung my scorai over my belt and adjusted the straps of my sleeve shield. "If I was one of your security detail in training, I'd have 5 bruises now to go with my 5 losses." Kirscher smiled and nodded. "You would. But an ex-guard bravo or a slum boy trying to make my grade needs the bruises to remind him that work here isn't some well-paid retirement. I don't believe you need to learn that sort of lesson." None of us are too wise to learn. We both looked and saw Medea entering the Pugnasium. She wandered around the edge of the mat, one moment in the shadows of the wall panels, the next in the glaring yellow oblongs cast by the skylights. She looked at me. "Just repeating one of your many aphorisms?" I could tell something was up with her. Kirscher shifted uncomfortably. "Let me spar with him," she said. I nodded to Jubal, who saluted Carthaean style with his scorer, and left the circular room. Medea took off her father's cerise jacket and hung it on a window knob. "What'll it be?" I asked, taking a sip of water from a beaker on the decanter stand. She walked over to the armory terminal and keyed on the screen, jump-cutting rapidly through the graphic templates the monitor displayed. She was dressed in a tight, semi-armored body glove, and her feet were clad in training slippers. She had prepared for this, I realized. "Blades and power bucklers," she announced, stopping the menu and keying the authority stud. There was a distant rattle and whir as automated systems in the armory under the floor processed the selected weapons from their racks and elevated them up into the ready rack in the wall next to the terminal. 2 buckler modules, 2 swords, matching, each the length of an adult human femur, single-edged and slightly curved with a knuckle bar around the grip. She tossed one to me, and I caught it neatly. I walked over to join her, placing my score eye in the rack that would return it to storage. Then I took my buckler. It strapped around the left forearm, supporting a round machined emitter the size of a pocket watch. Engaged, it projected a disk of shield energy the size of a banquet plate above the back of my hand and forearm. "Attention, you have selected weapons of lethal force. Attention, you have selected weapons of lethal force." The terminal issued the notice in soft but urgent repeats. I shut it off with a key press. "We can use full-body shields if you're worried," she said. "Why would I be worried? This is just sparring." We engaged our power bucklers and faced each other across the center of the mat, slightly side-on, shield towards shield, our blades held low in our right hands. "Signal cue," I said. 3, said the terminal speaker. 2, 1. Commence. Medea had been practicing. She swept round with her blade, and simultaneously parried my first approach with her buckler, which squealed and sparked off mine, as their fields met and repulsed. I undercut defensively, gathering her blade in towards our shields, so that for a moment all 4 weapons were locked in a protesting knot of spitting electrical energy. We broke and circled. She came in again, leading with her sword. I fended it away with my buckler, then again, and then for a 3rd time as we continued to go around. She was canny. Sword and buckler work was as old as all the worlds, and the trick to staying alive was to use the shield more than the sword. The trick to winning, however, was to use the sword more than the shield. I kept my buckler to the front, but, by seeming to be unguarded with her own force shield lagging back as if casually forgotten, she was inviting me to overstep or make a badly judged lunge. I left my blade well alone, keeping it where she could see it, and using my shield as Harlan Nail had schooled me. The buckler was a weapon. Not only could it block, it could lock or even break a blade. I had heard of some duels where the small shield's solid energy edge had actually delivered the killing stroke to an unprotected windpipe. Medea rotated suddenly, driving my buckler aside with a swipe of her own, and lashed in with her blade, dancing across the mat. I was forced to parry with my sword, and then rally hard as she kept up the pressure. Her blade sliced to within a hand's breadth of my face, and I cross-guarded desperately with both blade and buckler. She drove her own shield in under my guard and her own locked sword, and doubled me up with a punished strike to my midriff. I fell onto the mat. "Enough?" she asked. I got up. "We'll go again." She came at me again, leading with the blade as I had expected. I ducked, swung round, and feinted in time for her buckler to swing in to parry my blade. The spitting electrical dish tore the sword from my hand, stinging my fingers. Just as I had intended. Her eyes were on my sword, distracted as it flew aside. With my now free right hand, I grabbed her buckler arm above the elbow and pulled it down so that her own power shield locked with her sword as she brought it up. She stumbled. I smashed her across the extended shoulder with the flat of my buckler and knocked her down. I could have used the edge. I could have aimed for her exposed face. But we were sparring. "Enough?" I asked. She said nothing. "Medea?" She extinguished her buckler and pulled the strapping off. "What's on your mind?" Medea looked up at me. "I never wanted revenge," she said. "You told me you did." "I know. And I suppose I did. Part of me. Revenge. It doesn't feel satisfying. Like anything at all. Just empty. Stupid and empty." "Well, I could have told you that. In fact, I think I did." I helped her up. We didn't speak for a minute or two as we put the weapons back in the rack and returned them to the underfloor store bay. Then we took beakers of water from the stand, opened the Pugnasium's side doors, and went out onto the sunlit terrace. It was going to be a hot day. The sky was cloudless and the light white. The shade of the woods seemed gloriously dark and inviting. The distant inlet was hazy with glare, and the sea glinted like diamonds. "Ever since I was old enough to understand what Fade Thuring did," she said, "I've wanted something. I've always presumed it was revenge." "Revenge is a disguise for other more valid emotional responses," I said. She looked at me sourly. "Stop trying to be my father, Eisenhorn." She might as well have slapped me across the face. I had never thought of it that way. "I only meant," I began. "You're a very wise man," she said. "Very clever. Learned. You give people the most profound advice." "I try." "But you don't feel." "Feel, Medea? You know things, but you don't feel them." Birds twittered in the edges of the woods and the orchards. 2 of the junior ground staff were pressing the lower lawns with a heavy roller. I wasn't quite sure I knew what she meant. "I feel? No. You don't feel the content of your advice, most of the time. They're just wisdoms, without heart." "I'm sorry you think that way." "It isn't a criticism." "Well, not really. You are just so driven to do what is right that you forget to wonder why it's right. I mean..." "What?" "I don't know." "Try." She sipped her water. "You fight the way Kirsche tells you to fight because he says that's the best way to do it." "It usually is." "Of course. He's an expert. That's why you defeated me. But why is it the best way to fight? Using those weapons, for example." Because he told you?" "He's right. But why is he right? You never wonder about that sort of thing. You never wonder what mistakes or decisions were made to arrive at that right way." "I'm still not sure I follow you." She smiled and shook her head. "Of course you don't. That's my point. You've spent your whole life learning the best way to do everything. Learning the best way to fight, the best way to investigate, the best way to learn, even. Did you ever wonder why those are the best ways?" I put my glass down on the low wall at the edge of the terrace. "Life's too short." "My father's life was too short." I said nothing. "My father died, and I wanted something. And you told me that it wasn't revenge. And you were right. Revenge is trash. Worthless. But why? What was it I needed instead?" I shook my head. "I was only trying to spare you the effort. Revenge is a waste of time and—" "No," she said, looking at me directly. "It's a displacement activity. It's something you can lock onto and do because you can't do the thing you really want to do." I had grown impatient. "And what might that be, Medea?" "Do you know?" I asked. "I do now," she said. "Thuring killed my father. I needed something, and it wasn't payback. It was what he took from me. I needed to know my father. If I'd ever had that, then I'd never have given Thuring another thought." She was right. It was so obvious, it chilled me. I wondered how many other similar obvious mistakes I had made in my life, with my head so full of certain knowledge and my heart so numb. I looked back at the Pugnasium and saw Midas's cerise jacket hanging where she had left it, draped against the inside of one of the windows like a trapped butterfly. "I can give you what you want," I said. "In part, at least. If you really want it." I summoned my astropath, Vance, and requested that he made the preparations. He suggested that evening might be a good time, when things were quieter, and so I asked Yarat to serve a light dinner early, to leave the evening clear, and to leave out a cold supper in case we were hungry once we were done. At 7, Medea and I went to the reading room above the house's main library. I gave Kirsche specific instructions that we were not to be disturbed. Most of the household had retired early to private study or relaxation in any case. Sullus the rubricator was in the library, repairing some bindings that were fraying at the spines. "Give us a while," I said to him. He looked unnerved. Infirm with a progressive wasting disease, he virtually lived in the library. It was his private world, and I felt cruel, ousting him from it.
"What should I do?"
he asked cautiously. "Go sit in the study. Watch the stars come out. Take a good book." He looked around and sniggered. My library was at the heart of Spaton House and occupied 2 floors. The lower level was divided by alcoves of shelves, and the upper gallery was supported by those alcoves, giving access to further shelving stacks lining the gallery walls. Soft glow lamps hung from slender ceiling chains and cast a warm, golden light all around, and the panelled reading lecterns along the centre of the ground floor were fitted with individual reading lamps that generated little pockets of brighter blue luminescence. The place was comfortably warm, its atmosphere carefully controlled to guard against any excess humidity that might damage the stored books. There was a smell of wood polish, chemical preservatives, and the ozone whiff of the stasis fields that protected the oldest and most fragile specimens. Once Sullus had gone, taking with him a copy of Boyden Steyer's Lives, I led Medea up the brass staircase to the upper gallery and along to the heavy door of the private reading room at the far end. At the door, Medea paused and took a Glavian needle pistol from her pocket. "I brought this," she said. "It was also my father's. One of the pair made for him." I knew that well enough. Medea still carried the matched pistols in combat. "Leave it outside," I told her. "It's never a good idea to attempt connection through weapons, even friendly heirlooms like that. The sting of death attaches itself to them, and you'd find that unpleasant. The jacket will be fine." She nodded and left the gun on a bookshelf near the reading room door. We went inside and found Vance waiting for us. The small chamber was candle-lit, with 3 chairs arranged around a cloth-covered table. The last rays of sunset were glimmering in through the stained-glass skylight. We took our seats. Vance, a tall, stooping man with kindly, tired eyes, spread Midas's cerise jacket on the tablecloth. He had already been meditating enough to put him near to the trance state, and I gently guided Medea to a receptive calmness. The auto-seance began. It is a simple enough psychic procedure, and one which I have used many times for investigation and research. Vance was the conduit, channeling the power of the warp. I focused my own mind strength to keep us centered. From the point of transition, the room took on a cold, frosty light. Solids became translucent and fizzy. The dimensions of the little reading room stretched and shifted impatiently. Midas's jacket, now a wisp of turquoise smoke, was swathed in the aura it had accumulated over time, the echoes of its contact with human hands, human minds. "Take it," I said. "Touch it." Medea reached out her hand warily and brushed her fingers against the edge of the aura, which bloomed and fluffed up at her touch. "Oh," she said. We teased apart the psychic memories clinging to that garment until we found her father. Midas Betancourt, pilot, warrior, my friend. We coaxed his phantom out of hiding. It was no ghost, just the after-image he had left behind. An impression of him, his looks, his voice, his emotions. A distant hint of his rich chuckle. The faint odor of the low sticks he liked to smoke, and the cologne he chose to wear. We saw him young, little more than a boy. We saw him in virile middle age, just a few years from his untimely death. There, at the helm of the gun-cutter, itself now just a ghost too. The Glavian circuitry inlaid into his hands, marrying him profoundly to the craft's controls. There, steering a long prow. There, watching the suns rise over the stilt hills of Glavia. We tasted his grief at the death of Loris Vibben, but I had Vance pass along quickly to spare us the empathic pain. We clung to him through several exhilarating dogfights, sharing the joy of virtuoso maneuvers and expert kills. We watched as he saved my life, or the lives of my companions, over and again. We listened at a dinner table while he made the company roar and clap with an outrageous tale well told. It made all 3 of us laugh out loud. We saw him, in silence, studying a regicide board and trying to fathom out how Bequin had managed to beat him again. We watched him, through a blizzard of coloured streamers, take his bride to the altar of the high church at Glavia Glavis. I glimpsed myself alongside Fishig, Elizabeth, and Amos in the front pew, cheering and ringing our ceremonial bells with the rest of the congregation. "That's my mother," Medea whispered. The veiled woman on Midas's arm was stunning, exquisite. Jarana Shayna Betancourt. Midas always did have such good taste. Jarana lived still, far away on Glavia, a distinguished widow and director of a shipwriting firm. "She looks so young," Medea added. There was a note of sadness in her voice. She hadn't been back to Glavia to visit her mother for many years. Then, almost as if we were intruding, we saw Midas and Jarana embracing on the shores of Tewai Lake. Midas was beside himself with happiness and excitement.
Really? Really?
He kept asking. "Yes, Midas, really. I'm really pregnant." I looked at Medea, saw the tears in her eyes. "We should stop now, I think," I said. "No, I want to see more," she said. "We should," I advised. I could tell that Vance was getting tired, and I knew it wouldn't be long before we stumbled into memories of Fade Thuring and the last hours. We should stop. I was cut off by the sudden shrilling of my communicator. I cursed loudly. Kirscher had been told, no interruptions. The sound shattered the seance at once. The blue light flashed and vanished, and the room returned to normal with a sudden lurch that blew out the candles and cast us painfully out of the warp. Vance slumped forward, breathing hard in distress. My head ached with a sudden piercing pain. Medea pulled the jacket towards her across the table and buried her head into its silk folds, sobbing. The walls were sweating. Damn Kirscher, seances shouldn't be broken like that. Any one of us could have been badly damaged by the abrupt termination. As it was, we were all emotionally dazed. I got up. "Stay here," I said to them both. "Take a moment to recover." Vance nodded feebly. Medea was lost in her own storm of feelings. I went outside and pulled the door closed, breathing hard. Yanking the little hand-vox from my pocket, I keyed the respond rune. "This had better be good, Jubal," I said hoarsely. Static crackled back. "Jubal! Jubal! This is Eisenhorn!" Nothing. Then a quick blurt of frantic words I couldn't make out. Then static again. "Jubal!" From somewhere distant, on the other side of the house, I heard a trio of muffled cracks. Lasfire. I snatched up Midas's needle pistol from the shelf where Medea had left it, and ran for the library door. Chapter 8. The Fall of Spaton House. For Our Lives. Sastre. Loyal Sastre.